Hello again everyone and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John and as always thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What's a dark family secret that you were told about when you were older? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My dad's first cousin is a serial killer, Kenneth McDuff. We saw the American's Most Wanted episode when it aired and we were so surprised to hear about a McDuff, not knowing he was a relative. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids but actually 6. She gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his mistress and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, and having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home and, surprise, it took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remember this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later, my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, had no work, etc. He felt depressed that my dad had the life he always wanted, so he tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day my uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain worked, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. That's a very cool thing your parents did. It's not easy when something like that happens, but they did right by you. Good. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner and that he was really involved with the union, but it wasn't until after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. My grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer. She lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof, and my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly, so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in the early 20s, and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window, killing him. They lived in a rural area, so I never questioned it. One year I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad and he got this sad look on his face. It turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 1980s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers, and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. I have no idea why they decided to use the sword, but it was pretty weird to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16, but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now, and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck, never thinking something like that would get him killed. When I was very young, my family lived in a townhouse, and against all local bylaws, my mother decided to keep a horse in our backyard. Not only that, but it was an ex-racehorse that came as a package deal, the goat companion that slept in the closet of my nursery. I also later found out she was running a grow-op in the basement. When the neighbors moved, trigger warning for violent crime. I was pretty young when this happened, so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town, and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them, and their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day, they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused as there had been no clue where they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later, but that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become very ill. The cops came to tell the family, and they left immediately to take care of her and never came back. I was only about 5. It seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and having long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered whatever happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home, they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and killed the sitter. My mom stated that the cops think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home, they checked that the kids were safe and put them back to sleep. The police obviously came immediately. Once the kids were hard asleep, the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, and asked the cops to be silent as they walked them out and took them out of the house. They told the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them, as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. I'm not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully, my mom has long since divorced my dad and they live a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents, who lived close by at the time, circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3 or 4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night, our garbage can was burned to the ground and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom, a couple of years ago, watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned, where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill in the sled when I was 12. Also, my paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children in our small town. It turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. My father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest, and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. My grandpa, 15, kidnapped my grandma, 14, from a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter because she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. They had 16 children together. My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant, and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him, so he was legally my uncle. My dad left when I was 7, and we were always told that it just didn't work out with my parents. We saw him off, on and off again for about 2 years after he left, and never saw him again. He had remarried, and she had a kid that became his stepson that my brother and I would hang with when we would go to my dad's house. When I turned 13, my mom finally told me that the stepson was actually his son from having an affair with that woman, so that kid was my half-brother and I had no clue. My great-aunt's husband killed his first wife, then killed her. They lived in Puerto Rico, and he fled to New York City so my great-uncles wouldn't kill him. They found out where he was, came here, killed him, and went home. Growing up, I always knew my parents had marital issues, constant fighting. A couple times Dad disappeared for a few days living in his car, issues with drinking. But they stayed together. And when I asked why they didn't divorce, they always said they loved each other too much. And in the past few years, things seem to have gotten better. My parents, in fact, are now so comfortable in their relationship that they make jokes about all the awful stuff they've done to each other in front of me. What I've managed to put together is, my parents met when they were 14, and my mother was dating an 18-year-old, and my dad would relentlessly ask her out until she eventually dumped her boyfriend for my dad. My mother went to university after college, we're in the UK, whereas my dad dropped out of college and went straight into work while constantly drinking and partying. It was at one of these parties while my mom was studying that he cheated on my mom with someone from their old secondary school, so she dumped him. Barely a year later, my dad realizes he doesn't know how to do anything for himself. No one else wants him, and he goes crawling back to my mom. She agrees to take him back, but only if he marries her. Not immediately, but eventually, she said. He agrees, and a short year after that, aged 22 now, she's already pressuring him to propose. He fumbles it, frankly. They were in Paris, but forgot the ring and proposed back in the hotel room after they'd visited the Eiffel Tower that day, which was her dream proposal. But she says yes. A month after they're married, Mom pressures him into having the child that he doesn't want, and 9 months later, I was born. They soon realize how hard having a child is and basically pawn me off on my grandparents for the rest of my childhood. After me, there were 2 more accidental babies, and each time my dad threatened to leave her if she didn't abort them. She managed to convince him to stay while keeping my siblings by promising he wouldn't have to raise them. He didn't, but neither did she, and frankly, I did. After that is only what happened before or shortly after I was born. If I carried on into my childhood, we'd be here for years. What they sold to me as the perfect love story, been together since they were 14, proposed in Paris, soon married, and had children because of pure love, is in fact a bunch of skewered half-truths from a horrible twisted love map of my mother's manipulation and my father disappointing her time and time again. So it raises the question, is it better to stay together and be partially to moderately miserable for the kids, or do you cut ties and try to give them an example of a healthy relationship? It's not easy. I always thought my 2 older brothers got addicted to drugs because of their own decisions and people they hung out with. It turns out that my dad had been feeding them pills since they were about 10 to shut them up. Years later, I held resentment against them for not being good older brothers like they should have been, only to find out that it was my father, whom I had praised all those years, who was truly evil. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great-uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed away at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters on as farmhands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farmhands were out drinking, and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving, and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was thrown from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed cleanly in 2 pieces. Because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss about it, and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who has more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it's something that definitely sticks in my mind, and it's a story I'll tell my own kids when they get their license. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country and it was getting dangerous to stay there. And for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with World War I right around the corner. And I'm sure it was, but it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who had slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this, and with a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple of years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up the date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was floored. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her rages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try and raise another child. It is shocking to me that after someone commits a crime like that they have more children, or at least have access to children. I mean, I'm no judge, jury, or executioner, but it doesn't seem right. But I'm glad you're here, so. Finally, I got one. From when I was 6 to 13, my mom dated a fellow named Murray. We all lived together in an old farmhouse. Murray was a wonderful father figure to us, but he also had a drinking and driving problem, and after a particularly nasty accident, Mom waited until he came home from the hospital and was well enough to take care of himself before leaving. The whole time we lived there, my sister and I never went down into the basement, as it was infested with spiders. I always thought it was because of the drinking and driving she left him, but as it turns out, that was only part of it. The other was that he had a massive grow operation for weed in the basement. Mom stated that if the police had found out about this, she would have lost custody of us. Murray has long since passed, but we would have had a giggle knowing that weed is legal here now.